This is the A2, or what used to be the A2, in Gillingham in Kent. And standing beside that busy road is this monument, which was erected in memory of Will Adams, a native of Gillingham, who had a most interesting history. He is commemorated by the inscription on the side of the monument. Let's go and have a look at it. According to the inscription, Will Adams was an English sailor who served under Queen Elizabeth I, Walter Raleigh, Drake and all the rest of it. And then in 1598, finding that there weren't enough British ships for all the British sailors who needed jobs, the war had ended and so the sailors were cast off, he took service on a Dutch ship bound on a trading voyage for the East Indies. Unfortunately, something went wrong along the way. The ship suffered the privations that were so common in those times from storm and uncertain winds, and when finally it crept into harbour in Japan, well off its course, Will Adams and 5 other sailors were the only survivors from the crew, and they were helpless with scurvy, barely able to move. The natives of Japan took them prisoner, to be honest, and for a time their fate hung in the balance, whether they would be killed or whether they would survive. Somehow, Adams managed to gain the favor of the local shogun, and he received him into his service, and Adams became adept at teaching the Japanese the arts and skills of Europe. How to make ships. They could undertake long sea voyages beating against the wind, something that apparently the Japanese junks were unable to do. He taught them the art of making European cannons and European gunnery, and so on. For a time, though, things looked very dodgy for Adams, because also in Japan were some Roman Catholic missionaries. Now, we may admire the zeal of these men that took them to far-off lands to preach the gospel. What is less admirable is that they viewed this shipwrecked sailor, even in the earliest days of his stay in Japan, as a threat. Because Adams and the other sailors, the Dutch sailors, were Protestants. And so these Catholic missionaries did their best to have Adams and his compatriots killed. Not to put too fine a point on it. The local Japanese, however, quickly realized that Adams' practical skills were worth any amount of religious disagreements, and eventually Adams had the somewhat grim satisfaction of seeing the Catholic missionaries utterly routed and indeed expelled. Those, unfortunately, were intolerant times, and no one comes out of the story with particular credit. Today, this monument stands here beside the A2. And Gillingham and Yokosuka, if I've got the pronunciation correct, are twin cities. And there is an annual festival to commemorate the arrival of Williams in Japan. If you want to find out more about him, there is a fascinating little paperback book called Samurai Williams, which is well worth reading for a story of those interesting times and of how Williams served Japan, adopted the country, became almost Japanese, and eventually died out there in the land of his adoption. Whether he ever hankered after the green fields of England, we shall never know.